Hey there everyone. Today I'd like to talk about what Deleuze and Guattari mean by deterritorialization. This is a really central concept in understanding their theory, but it is so often misinterpreted and is one of the key factors that leads to the kind of misreadings of their theory that I see in, for example, accelerationists. In this episode, I would like to discuss some of the contributions of Friedrich Nietzsche in the Spoke Zarathustra, which we can see carried over into their discussions of deterritorialization in A Thousand Plateaus, in order for us to understand how deterritorialization is actually a much more sober point than many of the sort of misreaders of Deleuze and Guattari would like to have it. And thereby we might be able to understand in more detail exactly the place of deterritorialization in their theory as a component rather than as some absolute that is supposed to almost lead to a moral maxim. Deleuze and Guattari's theory can be so all-encompassing because they're trying to talk about very foundational things for so many disciplines, such as, for example, how do we be a creative thinker? Or how do we escape restrictive norms that inform our daily practices? This is why they can be so multidisciplinary, even in the way that people use their theory today, because, this can work for philosophers, for writers, for theologians, for biologists, for whatever. You could go all over the place, and that's why it's seen so many readings. But because so many people come to Deleuze and Guattari not as philosophers, they're often not willing to read Deleuze and Guattari as closely as they beg to be read. And when we do this, we get a lot of misunderstandings of their philosophy that could easily be ameliorated by simply looking more closely at their theory. And one of the things that Deleuze and Guattari, among other 68 philosophers, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, etc., are trying to do is figure out a new way of analyzing social structures and larger dynamics of power that isn't going to succumb to the easy solutions of things like fascism. So after a lot of these fascist regimes have really done their damage, there is a resurgence of, or rather a prominence of, anti-fascist movements, leading probably most significantly to May 68 in France, in which about a quarter of the French population was engaged in uprisings, in protests, in strikes, which particularly centered around restructuring the authoritarian structure of French universities. And of course, this is an amalgamation of a lot of different leftist movements. You've got communists and socialists, you've got anarchists, you've simply got reform-minded kind of democratic socialists or social democrats, just all kind of living in the same space. And because of that, of course, Deleuze and Guattari are writing in that context. They write Anti-Oedipus in 68, and then they write A Thousand Plateaus a little bit later, but still well influenced by that culture. A big central aspect of their analyses is to try to find ways out. And this does not mean escapism, but this does mean a more sober analysis of societal structures and really giving a dissolution to this idea of abstract identity that is not connected to the world. Deleuze and Guattari are trying, like many postmodernist philosophers, to dissimulate identity precisely by providing it with its context necessary, and in so doing, provide some way where we don't give recourse to an identity politics, but we do allow for a restructuring of identity. And this is one of Friedrich Nietzsche's big points. Zarathustra states in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. I tell you, you still have chaos in yourselves. Right? This might as well have been said by someone in May 68, because this is what is being actively encouraged, is that there are all sorts of flows that undergird our normative structures, what we take to be our timeless senses of identity, which actually undercut those, but thereby allow for a resurgence in a unique form of individuality, which comes from analyzing and immersing oneself and locating oneself in a societal structure. And Deleuze and Guattari noticed that there is a lot of chaos going on in societal structures. And particularly, things like capitalism are going to reel in this chaos, and they are going to instrumentalize it and use it for capitalism's purposes, for example. And they talk a lot about this in Anti-Oedipus, although it's figured fairly prominently in A Thousand Plateaus as well, how capitalism is going to use the sort of mass proliferation of the movement of goods, which is to say the deterritorialization of goods, in the literal geographic sense here, of goods are being removed from their territory and they are being, siphoned across various geographical points through various markets, and capitalism is going to try to control and compartmentalize this deterritorialization such that it becomes instrumentalized change. And we can see here that deterritorialization at its fundamental level is a very complicated way of just speaking about change or becoming. Deterritorialization, if we pick the word apart, has to do with removing something from its territory. And this territory can be thought of in the most general sense possible of somewhere where you feel at home. Something where lines are clearly drawn, boundaries have been set. Think about, for example, traditional gender roles. This would be an example of territory. It is relatively clearly defined how I ought to dress as someone who identifies as a man and doesn't necessarily find it necessary to depart from those categories too much. It's also fairly clearly delineated how I ought to speak, how I ought to address others, the kind of people I can be expected to romantically entertain or sexually entertain. This is an example of territory that has had a long history, but has also been influenced by things like patriarchal societal structures, right? Which have made it such that people grow up being taught that, this is how you ought to be gendered in such and such a way. And deterritorialization has been taken up by feminist philosophers, for example, or queer philosophers, who have, for example, Gilles, who have looked at desire, and they've looked at the way that we actually work in the world, and they've said, well, this is actually quite a reductive understanding of what it means to cement my territory, so to speak, when it comes to my identity. And in fact, an act of deterritorialization can be to willfully take myself out of that imposed framework and try to create a framework for myself, to wrest that chaos inside of myself, and indeed inside of society as a whole that has been put on hold by the normative structures, such as the kind that would gender people. And in fact, Friedrich Nietzsche wants to make very clear that creation and destruction are intimately bred together. Every act of creation is simultaneously an act of destruction, and vice versa. Every act of destruction is simultaneously an act of creation. As he says, you will be a heretic to yourself, and witch and soothsayer and fool and doubter and unholy one and villain. You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you become new if you had not first become ashes? Lonely one, you are going the way of the Creator. You would create a god for yourself out of your 7 devils. Lonely one, you are going the way of the lover. You love yourself, and therefore you despise yourself as only lovers despise. The lover wants to create because he despises. What does he know of love who has not had to despise precisely what he loved? And this love-hate relationship is very intentional in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, where they look at societal structures, and Deleuze and Guattari make explicit that we need structures of some kind. Not only do we need them, we already have them. One of the biggest misreadings of deterritorialization is to deny the idea of territory, of fixed identity altogether, or to the importance of identity in structuring our lives, and to say, no, we must simply deterritorialize, break down all the walls, break down all the things that are holding me back, become, a free spirit. But that's way too reductive. Because Deleuze and Guattari, as we will come to find out, point out the problem of just thinking of life as destruction. Nietzsche, in fact, figures this fairly prominently in Spoke Zarathustra when he speaks of the 3 metamorphoses. And he says that these 3 metamorphoses are the spirit becoming a camel becoming a lion, and a lion becoming a child. And this first stage can be seen as the voluntary wayfarer who goes into the void, who goes into the unknown. And then the lion is one who can create freedom for oneself and give a sacred no even to duty. So this is someone who is willfully going to cut down certain imposed categories, for example, such as the duty to one's country. The lion is the one who is going to say, no, I am not justified by the duty to my country, for example. I exist apart from this category which has been imposed onto me, and which I have been led to believe, I am an American, and to be without my duty to my country, I am somehow lost. He once loved thou shalt as most sacred. Now he must find illusion and arbitrariness, even in the most sacred things, that he may steal his freedom from his love. The lion is needed for such prey. And this is, of course, a very revolutionary position, the likes of which we can see in the May 68 movement, where there is a willful dissolution of certain categories for how we ought to structure education, how we ought to structure public discourse, how young and old people must relate to each other. Indeed, how young and old people together must relate to the state. This almost led to the downfall of the French state. But of course, approaching life just as a critical project of destruction, of deterritorialization, is not what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say. And the accelerationists would like to make us believe that this is in fact what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say. But we must take heed of the third metamorphosis that Nietzsche speaks of. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes-saying. Yes, for the game of creating, my brothers, a sacred yes-saying is needed. The spirit now wills his own will, and he who had been the world's outcast now conquers his own world. So in order to genuinely create, it does require, in a sense, forgetting these categories, precisely insofar as when I engage in a social interaction, it is necessarily the case that if I want to be creative in how I present myself, it is not just a matter of denying gender's influence on me, but in a sense by also forgetting gender and coming in as first an individual, as indeed a series of flows, as being located within an assemblage, as Deleuze and Guattari want to point out. And in so doing, I entertain the yes-saying of creative gestures, which are indeed also a form of territorialization. But specifically, they are reterritorialization. So I have, in the second metamorphosis, in which I have become lion and I have deterritorialized, when I have destroyed the territory, I have now come back and I have chose to reestablish, to redraw lines. Most specifically, permeable boundary lines, by following lines of flight, as Deleuze and Guattari say. This is the path to creation that does not simply sit comfortably in being critical, for example. Indeed, Deleuze and Guattari are often called, members of critical theory. And indeed, much of their project is critical. But Deleuze and Guattari, unlike any other of the 68 thinkers or the postmodern thinkers in general, want us to think about genuine creation like Nietzsche does. Now, of course, lines of flight and deterritorialization are very similar. Line of flight can be seen as a creative potential which lies latent yet imminent in an assemblage and allows for the possibility for some new creation. It is a line which often does go against the established sedentary boundaries of society, goes beyond these normative frameworks, and indeed is a radical proposition. But they state that they themselves, that being the lines of flight, emanate a strange despair, like an odor of death and immolation, a state of war from which one returns broken. They have their own dangers, distinct from the ones previously discussed. Why is the line of flight a war one risks coming back from, defeated, destroyed, after having destroyed everything one could? This precisely is the fourth danger. The line of flight crossing the wall. Getting out of the black holes, but instead of connecting with other lines and each time augmenting its valence, turning to destruction, abolition, pure and simple, the passion of abolition. Like Kleist's line of flight and the strange war he wages, like suicide, double suicide, a way out that turns the line of flight into a line of death. This is a passage that I never hear discussed, and it goes against the narrative that, deterritorialization is just radical and awesome and always good. No. In fact, this is one of the microfascisms they speak of, which is taken advantage of by someone like Hitler, for example, who was able to mobilize society to deterritorialize, to break down some of the old structures of, the government, and to re-territorialize it onto a fascist assemblage. To restructure society by taking advantage of our predisposition to think of deterritorialization as an absolute good, to think of it as a moral maxim, which it is not. Think of it more as a suggestion, which is terribly context dependent. Because in fact, when they discuss capitalism, for example, they discuss the fact that capitalism, too, deterritorializes and thrives on deterritorialization. Think of the literal destruction of territory that comes from colonial imposition into native land. This can in fact be a fast track for capital to extract profit from people who have been ravaged by war. So in fact, deterritorialization, this sort of movement can be broadcasted, can be advertised, can be sold as something revolutionary. In fact, this is what the Nazis did. This is what Mussolini did too. They too took part in the scramble for Africa. And in such a situation, we have the case where deterritorialization is in fact concretely something bad. because what they are trying to show is that if we think about territory like a solar system, in which there are a series of orbits, there are a series of comfortable places to live. If we actually zoom in, we see that there are all sorts of particles which merely happen to be brought into these orbits by gravity. They have been brought into confluence by these orbits, but in fact there are lines of flight. There are possibilities to escape these orbits. But if we merely think, as in the case with the lion in the second metamorphosis, of merely escape, merely destruction, if we merely seek to escape black holes, which would be things like social norms, these imposing categories which tie us down, if we only think about deterritorialization this way, then we engage in an act of willful suicide. And this can be instrumentalized to our deficit, right? This can be used to get us to, as they say in Anti-Oedipus, desire our own oppression. Desire to do things on behalf of another power that would willfully see us falter. So in the case of deterritorialization, it is the case that it is not merely good in and of itself. It must be seen in its context. As they say, this condition is met only if there is a certain simplicity in the non-uniform material. So this is to say, simple, basic elements which have not yet been coded very well. This would be things like, for them, desire. Things which have been claimed to be put into certain categories, as in the case for Freud with the Oedipus complex. That this is what young boys desire, to kill their father and, have sex with their mother. Freud is claiming that there are these boundaries, but in fact, when we get down to the basic, non-uniform material, they talk about this sort of elementary matter of desire, but we could think of this in other ways as well. A maximum of calculated sobriety in relation to the disparate elements and parameters. So there is a focus on the sobriety of an analysis which is going to go down to more elementary factors, or more specific factors than, for example, the state with a capital S. This is something they critique when discussing capitalism, because the state is such a broad category. The state is itself merely an emergent entity feeding off of markets, feeding off of people who exist in, towns and cities such that they can be classified as members of a state. It exists as a byproduct of power relations which allow for the simplistic understanding of power as simply the state. But in fact, it's not the state. First off, it's a bunch of different states all acting together in this world market. But within that, it is microstates and it's constant microphenomena which allow, if we see them soberly, for the possibility for creative action. They say the sobriety of the assemblages is what makes for the richness of the machine's effects. People often have too much of the tendency, and this is key, to re-territorialize on the child, the mad, noise. If this is done, one fuzzifies instead of making the fuzzy aggregate consist, or harnessing cosmic forces in the deterritorialized material. So what they're saying here is that it's so easy to talk about, oh, you just need to become schizo, dude. You just need to embrace your inner madman, and you need to just deterritorialize everything. It's really easy to say that. But when you bring this into, for example, a medical context, and you start thinking about mental health, you can't do that, or you literally become schizophrenic, which is something Deleuze and Guattari very clearly state is not something we should desire, insofar as it is a maladaptive behavior. It's not fun to exist as a schizophrenic. And when Deleuze and Guattari talk about schizophrenia, they are using it in an abstract way which is admittedly easy to misread, but it leads to this understanding of desire, for example, as something which should just constantly live beyond all categories, which should be absolutely deterritorialized at all points. And we should just, oh, become animal, dude, become schizo, become mad. If you take that too seriously and you start treating it as an axiom, a normative axiom which must always be the case in every situation without giving a sober analysis to the elements, you leave yourself prey to very dangerous and indeed fascistic movements. They say your synthesis of disparate elements will be all the stronger if you proceed with a sober gesture, an act of consistency, capture, or extraction that works in a material that is not meager but prodigiously simplified, creatively limited, selected. For there is no imagination outside of technique. The modern figure is not the child or the lunatic, still less the artist, but the cosmic artisan, a homemade atomic bomb. And I love this passage because it's so easy to read Deleuze and Guattari as constantly being talking about escaping, for example, capture. Right? You hear the apparatus of capture, and you hear them talk about the apparatus of capture as something which can oftentimes be bad. And you think, oh, I don't want to be captured. But they specifically say here, when talking about our homemade atom bomb, about being a cosmic artisan, that it requires limiting and selecting and capture. Because, as they say, deterritorialization is predicated on the idea of a territory which is being deterritorialized. So it requires understanding that, in fact, there are identity categories which are already there. Not as absolutes, but they are there, and they must be analyzed. And they must be carefully understood such that if we want to create new categories, which in fact is what Deleuze and Guattari want us to do, they do want us to make new categories, but permeable categories, like a very permeable cell membrane, which can allow for the dissolution of fascistic structures, for overly sedentary structures. So when we think of deterritorialization, it's very easy to think of it as just a purely radical, revolutionary thing. But we must keep in mind that desire itself is revolutionary. I discussed this in my lecture on desiring production. It's not like we actually have to do some crazy thing all the time just to be revolutionary in Deleuze and Guattari's sense of the term. And in fact, deterritorializing is something you can do quite regularly. It can merely mean, for example, taking 1,000 Plateaus and taking it out of a territorialized discourse for talking about it. It can mean bringing it into city planning or bringing it into maybe gender theory, which, that's kind of a well-trodden path. But, it literally can mean taking something out of its territory as defined by a discourse and merely reanalyzing it. And that is indeed a way of destroying this text, for example, as being bound to a discourse that is specific, that is well delineated. But it is also an act of creation, of creating new readings. So we can see that deterritorialization is incomplete without territory, which is already there, and reterritorialization, which does require things like capture, limiting, selecting. Think of evolution, one of the most creative practices which they mention in the Geology of Morals. This requires natural selection. It requires some contingent axiom of a sort to selectively select certain traits which can be carried on through a lineage. So all of this does in fact require a sober gesture, creation, but also destruction, and indeed selection, capture, limitation, and indeed the sort of, the typical breaking out of all these boundaries. So this is a very multifaceted thing you can see, which is not very reductively able to be understood. You can't be general when you talk about deterritorialization. You have to be context dependent and talk about, well, how does this fit into this social milieu, this, historical situation, whatever it may be. So I hope this has helped make sense of what Deleuze and Guattari mean by deterritorialization. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, postcolonial studies, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.